I'm going to start by telling you a story that is kind of embarrassing. I wondered if I should tell this or not. It's not that embarrassing, but it's kind of... So we were living in the Kansas City area. I was a youth pastor at a church. We were probably in my mid-20s. And one of the things I really like is the college basketball tournament. And so I thought, hey, it's the Final Four weekend coming up. There'll be 2 games. I'm going to invite some other guys in the church. Hang out with the youth all the time. But I'm going to invite some of the other men in the church to come over and watch some football or watch some basketball for the Final Four. And so not a big group, but maybe 4 or 5 or 6 guys who were about my age, mid-20s, which that might have been a mistake, invited them. And there were several. But, one kind of gave me a firm, yeah, I'll be there. And the other ones were like, yeah, I think I can be there. I've got something that may come up, but I'll do my best. And this was before, texting and all that, so communication was a little bit harder. So, we made some food and got some wings and made some of you are laughing because you know where this is headed. Some guacamole, and Felicia was like, well, how many people are coming? And I said, well, I know one for sure, and there were like 4 others who were like, probably. So get all the food out, get the game on, and nobody showed up to my party. I sat there all by myself, watched the games, eating the food, in my loneliness, with none of my friends there. I threw a party, and nobody showed up. Everybody says, "Aw, right, feel bad for me." It's embarrassing though, right? It's like, hey, do people like me? Am I like somebody that people don't want to hang around? So I threw a party and nobody showed up, and it was awkward and embarrassing, humiliating, that I've never really told anybody that story until just now. And I tell that story because here in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is going to tell a story of a party in which people do not show up for the party. But it's not some 20-something youth pastor and a few of his buddies. It's a king and the king's son and his wedding. And Jesus is going to tell this parable. We've been in this series called Judgment, and here's what's been going on in this series. Go ahead and go on to the next. Maybe. So we're in Matthew chapter 22. We're going to look at the parable of the wedding feast. Next. So this is kind of, as we've been looking at this whole part of Matthew, and this is really a big question in Matthew in particular, but if Jesus is the promised king of the Jews, we looked at this question last week, if it looks familiar, why did the Jewish leaders reject him? And so this parable of the wedding feast is the third in a series of 3 parables that are kind of teaching very similar things. So just for the context, so here's what's going on. This is a model of the city of Jerusalem. I showed this a few weeks ago. This is the temple area. This is the actual temple and the temple court, and this is the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. Big, big area, multiple acres. And this is the setting where Jesus is doing all of this. He is teaching here in the temple courts. It's Passover week, what we would call today Passion Week or Holy Week. And Jesus is here teaching. And he's been interacting with the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders. They've been asking him things like, by what authority do you do these things? And Jesus has now told 3 parables in a row. The parable of the 2 sons, the parable of the vineyard, and the parable today we're going to see of the wedding. And so if you remember the parable of the 2 sons, you remember that one? There was a man who had 2 sons, and the first one, he asked him to do something, and the son said, I will not. And then he went and did it. The second son said, I will, and then he didn't. Which one of those sons did the will of the father? The parable of the tenants of the vineyard, do you remember that one? The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who built a vineyard, and he sent his servants to go and get the fruit. And they killed the servants, one after another, until he sent his son, and he killed the son. And what will the landowner do with those at the end? And now in this same vein, this is teaching about the rejection of Jesus by the Jewish leaders. This is teaching the same thing. This will be the same. So our question today, though, it takes a little bit of a different turn. So if the Jewish leaders who rejected Jesus are outside of the people of God, who then are the people of God? Isn't that a lot of what the parable of the vineyard had taught us? That those who killed the servants and those who killed the son, that when the king comes, he will put them to a miserable end. And Jesus is saying too, and he said to them overtly, we saw this last week, the kingdom of God is being taken from you and given to those who will produce its fruit. So if the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus, they're outside of the people of God. Who is going to constitute the people of God? If they're not in, who is? So, Matthew chapter 22. A lot of times in parables, I like to read the whole thing all the way through and then go back through kind of verse by verse and look at it. So let's read the whole thing, verse number 1 to verse number 14. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast. But they would not come. And again he sent another servant, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fat calves have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned the city. And then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you can find. And the servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to them, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. And the king said to his attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. So we have here a parable, and if you're new to Bible study, Bible reading, Bible understanding, a parable is a story that's intended to communicate a spiritual truth. And the history of interpretation of parables can be quite comical. If you ever do any study, read any commentaries of the strange and fanciful and colorful interpretations that people come up with. And a lot of times they're very allegorical, and all of these things represents that, all down to the very minute details of the story. And if you interpret a parable that way, you can end up who knows where. When it comes to interpreting a parable, here's the first question you have to ask. What is the point? What is the singular point that Jesus is making when he tells this parable? And when you understand the singular point, then you can go back and start to piece together that certain things represent certain things and other things are just details of the story that don't really matter. But if you don't answer this question, if you don't get to the bottom of what is the main number one point that Jesus is trying to communicate with this parable, you can make a parable basically say anything you want. Now, the good news of this parable, Matthew chapter 22, is that Jesus supplies the point for us. We don't have to guess. Did you catch it? It was in verse number 14, the very last verse. Here's the point. For many are called, but few are chosen. The whole story of this wedding banquet is illustrating this point, making it come alive. So when we read it again, we have to ask ourselves a few questions, namely, go back. Who are the called? And why are there many of them? And who are the chosen? And why are there few of them? And who did the calling? And what is the outcome of those who were called and those who were chosen? How does this work? What does this statement mean? For many are called, but few are chosen. So let's start again. Matthew chapter 22, and we'll go a little slower verse by verse. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent his servants to call, we saw the word called, many are called, to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. We're going to see this word invited repeatedly throughout this parable. In fact, I would argue that this term invited refers to those who are called at the end. That the called, when it says many are called, it's not calling in the sense of that we understand somebody called by God or God has, called my name to salvation. I would argue it's a synonym for this invited here. That when Jesus says that many are called but few are chosen, he's pointing to the fact that in this parable, the king went out and invited many guests, but they would not come. Next. And again, he sent other servants, more. We looked last week in detail at the prophets and how they had come and shared the message of salvation, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. Next. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants and threatened them shamefully and killed them. So in their culture, the preparations and dates and things were more complicated, not as easy as they are now. We can put out, a save the date to a wedding, several months in advance. We can put out a invitation, a formal invitation. People can come. We can make sure that everything is ready. But in their day, it wasn't quite that simple. So usually what would happen is they would send out the call and say to those who are invited, the wedding feast is near. It's at hand. You are invited. And they would make preparations, and they would do everything, and they would slaughter the animals, and they would do all the butchery, and they would do all the cooking. And then finally, a lot of times the day of, or the day before, when everything was finally going to be ready, and we see this borne out here in the parable, they would then go out and send the second invitation, basically saying, it's ready, come. And so Jesus tells this story not just of a father, but of a king. And the king is having a wedding for his son, and it's presumed here that those who are invited are the dignitaries, they're the important people, they're the bigwigs, and they spurn the king's invitation. I mean, think about how this would almost be an act of rebellion or treason. This is not just, hey, my neighbor is having a party and I'm not going to come. This is the king, and nobody's showing up. He's honoring his son, and nobody will celebrate. And everything is ready. The time has come. The party is not going to happen tomorrow or the day after. The food is ready. It's hot. The preparations have been made. The time is now come, and nobody will come. Next. And the king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Many see this and see it allusion to the coming fall of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem in 70 AD will be taken over by the Romans. And that's where it's going to find its fulfillment. And then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Why were they not worthy? They didn't love the Son. They didn't honor the Son. They didn't love the King. They didn't honor the King. They were more concerned about their business and their animals and their life. In fact, they were so treacherous and treasonous that they killed the king's servants. And those who were invited were not worthy. Keep going. Therefore, go into the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you can find. So those who were invited at the beginning, those people who were somebody, were not interested. In fact, they actively rebelled, actively scorned the king. And everything is ready. The son is ready. The wedding, the bride is ready. Everything is here. The king is here. And there's got to be people who respond. And so the king says, go out and invite as many as you can find. Next. And the servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found. Many are called. Many are invited. The call goes out to everyone. Everyone is invited to the king's banquet. And to put it in terms more specific, many are invited to the table of the new kingdom in Jesus. All are invited. Whosoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. The invitation is for everybody. The invitation for salvation, the invitation to dine at the marriage supper of the Lamb, the invitation is for everybody. It's for all of our neighbors. It's for those who live by our new property. It's for those who are on campus. It's for those who are in nursing homes. The call of Jesus is for everybody. Everybody is called. Doesn't matter if you're bad or good. Everybody is invited. And we've talked about how this little mini-series on judgment cuts both ways. It's a good thing and it's a bad thing. And it's a good thing in that when the religious leaders of Jerusalem rejected Jesus, they made the point all the more clearly that everybody was invited. And so the wedding hall was filled with guests. End of story. Praise God. A lot of people get saved. Let's move on. But then Jesus tells a story about a man not wearing wedding clothes and being cast out. What is Jesus teaching with this? Let's read it. But when the king came in to look at the guest, he saw there was a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. And the king said to his attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and cast him into outer darkness. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So let's ask this question. So what is this wedding garment? Some would say, and this is kind of what I used to hear, and as I've done some more study, I don't think it's quite accurate, that in their day that the one throwing the wedding would provide wedding garments to them when they came, and it sounds good, but it just doesn't seem to bear historical scrutiny. What seems to be going on here is that the wedding garments were simply clean clothes. Nice, usually white, linen clothes. That to accept the invitation, when the servants went out to call everybody, that to accept the invitation of the king properly would have meant to go change your clothes. Change out of your work clothes, put on nice clothes, clean clothes, laundered clothes. And it seems that there was a man who heard the call and was, for whatever reason, was unwilling or unable to change his clothes. So what is this symbolizing? What is this meaning? Well, one commentator says it this way. I don't quote commentaries very often, but I thought this was good. It says the symbolism is of someone who presumes on the free offer of salvation by assuming that therefore there are no obligations attached. Someone whose life belies their profession. namely, faith without works. See, when you read the beginning of the parable without this ending, there's one thing that kind of gnaws at me, and maybe it gnaws at you as well, is that the gospel is not that those who are of status and power and position are excluded from the kingdom, and that everybody who was humble and poor and hurting and sick is in. That's not the message of the kingdom. The message of the kingdom certainly is that Jesus loves the humble and the poor and the hurting and the least of these. He loves them, but they don't get into the kingdom just because of their low status. That's not how it works. And so when you read the parable without this ending, it kind of seems like that Jesus is pitting the haves against the have-nots, the powerful against the non-powerful. That those who have are outside of the kingdom, those who have not are invited in. And now we see this case in which someone who was not one of the original invitees was rejected, made to leave from the wedding banquet. Why? Because he wasn't wearing wedding garments. Because he hadn't really accepted the invitation of the king. There wasn't a repentant heart. There wasn't a change of life. There wasn't a change of allegiance. It was just simply show up and have a meal. It was cheap grace. Grace that doesn't cost anything. Grace that requires nothing of us. And I think that's what's going on here, is that this man symbolizes someone who we've seen multiple times in Matthew, that those of high position presuming upon the grace of God. And now we see one of the rare examples of someone of a low position presuming upon his grace as well. The haves aren't rejected just because they have. And the have-nots aren't accepted just because they have not. Everyone has to accept the invitation of the king. Put on clean wedding garments and follow the Son. Next. So what is this place? Where do they go? What is this place of outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth? Now, we're going to go through this kind of quickly. This is almost a little bit of an aside in the sermon, a footnote. But this phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, has come up several times already in Matthew and is going to come up again. And at some point in our series, I wanted to tie all of the pieces together of what's going on with this weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we're going to go quickly. You might just want to write down some scripture references and go back and look at them later. But let's look here at the list. So we've seen it in Matthew 8, twice in Matthew 13, two different parables. Here we're in Matthew 22, and then in Matthew 24, and again in 25. We're going to see this exact phrase. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It is verbatim. So when Matthew says that, what's his point? What are the common themes that we see? So let's go quickly. Verse 12, that's the faith of the centurion, the Gentile centurion. And let me just tell you the end so you can see it. The end is this place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. What we're constantly going to see is that when God divides his people between those who are in the kingdom and those who are out of the kingdom, the place of the people out of the kingdom is routinely referred to as the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we see this divide over and over and over again. So this is the Gentile centurion, if you remember the story from Matthew chapter 8. Not Jewish. Let's go on. And again, if we're in Matthew and he's talking about those who reject and those who accept. Look at these themes. These themes have been running all the way through the book of Matthew. It says when Jesus heard this, the centurion's confession, when he heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly, I tell you, no one in Israel, none of the haves, no one in Israel have I found such faith." But I tell you, many will come from the east and the west and recline. Look at this language. He could have put this in Matthew 22. Well, many will come from the east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Many who are outside are going to be in the people of God. They'll be in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom, the insiders, will be thrown into outer darkness. Next. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All the way back at chapter 8, Jesus is saying, I don't see this kind of faith that the centurion has anywhere in Israel. Many are going to come from the east and the west, and they're going to recline at Abraham's table. They're going to have a seat. They're going to be in the banquet. They're going to be there. But many sons of the kingdom who don't have the faith of this centurion are going to be in outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth. The next, the parable of the weeds. Remember too, there was the field and it had wheat and tares that grew up in it, wheat and weeds. And the Son of Man will send his angels and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. And in that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So two different types of grain grow up, or one grain, one weed. They'll be separated. The good grain will be put in the barn. The bad grain will be burned in a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Next, still in chapter 13, parable of the net essentially tells the same story. So it will be at the end of the age, the angels will come and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace, and in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The next place is our current Matthew 22. So now let's skip ahead to 24:51, the parable of the faithful and the wicked servants. This is just a really short parable where they hear of the master's departure, and one acts righteously and justly, and one uses the master's departure as an excuse to sin. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then finally, the parable of the talents. To one was 5, one was 2, one was 1. 2 had doubled their talents. 1 buried his talent in the ground. And here's what it says about that one. For everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into outer darkness. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The gnashing of teeth is like grinding your teeth in sorrow and pain. Why? Because you've been separated from God and separated from the people of God. An eternity away from God. See, we understand this as, not just a little story that we tell, but that people's eternal destiny is at stake in how they respond to the invitation of the King. That there is a real heaven and there is a real hell. And that those who are separated from God face that. So, many are called, but few are chosen. The invitation to come to the banquet goes out to everybody. The invitation to salvation goes out to everyone, but not everyone comes to the banquet. And there are some who come and it looks like everything is okay, but they're not repentant. They're maybe even sitting in church week after week, but they're not among the chosen. Their hearts are not clean. Their lives are not consecrated. Their faith is not in Jesus. They're sitting in the right place, but they aren't wearing the robes of righteousness. Many are called, but few are chosen. And he said to his servants, The wedding feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. This is the problem. Those who were invited would not come. So let's look here. So who are the chosen? To put it in terms of the three parables that we've looked at in Matthew 21 and 22, the chosen are the sons who obey the Father. The chosen are the vineyard tenants who produce its fruit. The chosen are the banquet attendees wearing wedding garments. The chosen are the plants that grow and produce 30, 60, and 100-fold. You could go, the chosen are the wheat and not the tares. The chosen are the good fish in the net. The chosen are those who produce the fruit of the kingdom. These are the chosen. So if the religious leaders are rejecting Jesus, who are going to populate the people of God? Everyone who comes to the banquet, everyone who responds to the invitation of the king, everyone who wears wedding clothes, who are clean, everyone who walks in the grace of Jesus. Many are called, but few are chosen. Now I want to look at one more thing before we close. Back at verse number 10. Jesus said, "And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests." So we've been looking at this parable through the lens of, am I one who has responded to the call of to the banquet? Am I one who has put on wedding garments and am clean? Am I one of the ones who have responded? But if we turn and look at this parable in a little bit different light, maybe put ourselves in this position of the servants who are inviting. The servants went out and invited and found both bad and good. And I want to remind us that the message of salvation is for people who kind of have their lives together and are doing life in a reasonably good and moral way, but are away from Jesus and they need forgiveness. The message is for them. The message is also for those whose lives are being destroyed by sin. People that we would look at and say, they are as far from God as anybody that I could imagine. The things of God have nothing to do with how they live their lives. They are sinning and proud sinners and openly sinners and are hostile toward God. The call goes out from the servants to everyone, both bad and good. And when we step into this role of the servants and become inviters to the banquet, may we have a heart for both. May we have a heart for people whose lives are destroyed by sin and who are far from God, and for those who maybe seem to have it all together. I think it's good to ask ourselves, who can we invite to the King's banquet? Who can we invite to the supper of the Son?